Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure and an honor to talk to you today on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on vulnerable countries. The poorer and more vulnerable countries in the world have experienced the COVID-19 pandemic in an interesting and different fashion. For them, it began first as an economic crisis, as the global demand plummeted for the commodities that they produce and export. As the health crisis in China and Europe worsened, the economic crisis in these vulnerable countries, many of them in Africa, also worsened. Taking countries in Africa, for example, commodity prices plunged. For example, between December 2019 and March 2020, oil prices dropped by 50%, and in fact, oil prices are still dropping. The price of industrial metals dropped by 11%. Tourism receipts declined. Remittances also declined. All this led to macroeconomic instability, to capital flight and exchange rate volatility. Also a rise in inflation, which was in fact compounded by the fact that the most important food and pharmaceutical imports that these countries import became hard to come by as supply chains dried up. When the pandemic arrived and the health crisis set in vulnerable countries, governments acted responsibly. They implemented lockdowns, border tightenings and closures, social distancing. While this has been necessary to save lives, it has compounded the economic crisis and led to a social and possibly food crisis. 70% of workers in Africa's urban areas, for instance, are in the informal sector, earning their living on a day-to-day basis. Lockdowns mean that there's no money, no work, no money, no food for the family. So you can have a perfect storm in vulnerable countries of a health crisis which morphs into an economic and financial crisis, and then into a food crisis, all of this leading to a social crisis and possible unrest. This type of situation is what must be mitigated. The international community must fight this global public bad, that is the pandemic, by finding an approach that promotes the global public good. It is important for the world to understand that no country is safe in this pandemic until all countries are safe. Rich countries have the ability to deliver large fiscal stimuluses to their economies and to spend their way out of the economic and health crisis. Vulnerable countries do not have that, and they do not have the fiscal space. These countries have implemented the right policies. The lockdowns, as I said earlier, they've also waived taxes and taken other fiscal and economic measures in order to provide some measure of stimulus for their economies and to be able to feed vulnerable families and help households and small businesses. You know, G7 countries implemented a fiscal stimulus of about 8 to 10% of GDP. Japan even went as high as 20% of GDP. If I take African countries, for example, again, they were able to implement a stimulus of 0.8% of GDP, just about 1/10 of what the rich countries were able to do. So the international community must come up with additional support and additional resources to assist. And this can take several formats. One of the things that we've suggested is a debt standstill. A 2-year debt standstill will release resources which vulnerable countries can use immediately to be able to buy medical supplies and equipment, test kits, ventilators, pay community health workers and other health workers. As you know, many of these countries are indebted. Some of it is bilateral debt, some of it is multilateral, some of it is private and commercial. That is why it's necessary that there should be consideration for an across-the-board 2-year standstill to release resources for these countries. So that's for the short term. Focus on the health issues and buying the necessary supplies and equipment which are in short supply in these countries. In the medium term, there should be support for a viable and sustainable solution to the pandemic and to the health crisis. And that is in the nature of a vaccine. There must be support for the development, delivery, and scaling up of a vaccine that can serve not only the rich world, but also will be available for poorer and vulnerable countries at affordable prices. Rich countries cannot be allowed to have this sustainable solution to the health crisis to themselves alone. In the longer term, health systems of all countries, which have shown themselves to be really vulnerable, but especially that of poorer countries, must be revamped, strengthened, and made more resilient to be able to deal with a future pandemic. Economies must be reformed and diversified in the poorer countries so that they can withstand exogenous shocks and again be more resilient for the future. All this must then translate into people. At the end of the day, it's all about people. It's about making sure that poorer people among us, poor people in the vulnerable countries, are made strong, that households have the transfers, the resources, and the support they need in order to survive, that children, girls, boys, are made strong and able to go to school and have hope for the future, that in short, households are made resilient, that their farms, their other small businesses are strengthened to earn their livelihoods for the future. This is what this is all about. Working together, turning a global public bad into a global public good. We can and we must defeat the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you.